Greetings, quilters. Our son showed us a quilt about a year ago, and I have been thinking about those who made it and remembering my mother making quilts when I was a youngster. I could imagine the women that made this quilt working together and talking about the things of the day and enjoying each other and being part of each other's lives. You can see that the quilt was well made with a great deal of precision and expertise. The points of each block matched the block next to it. I wondered how I would do compared to what they had done. The challenge is on. As you can see, this quilt was completely sewn by hand. You can also see that it is very worn. Our guess is that this quilt was made about 80 years ago, give or take 20. We don't know what the name of this quilt pattern is. We have made Lemoyne star quilts before, and this quilt is very similar. We started by creating the quilt block, then arranged the blocks to make a quilt top. Note that these blocks are not the same. Some have the white point up and others have the colored point up. It is important to be aware of this when designing the block layout. We use our EQ8 program to create the 3 pattern pieces used to make the block. We did some calculations to determine how to cut the fabric and how much fabric was needed. We used spray adhesive to glue the pattern to the plastic template material. For this template, we used extra thick plastic. We cut the patterns out using scissors, marked for this process, not fabric scissors. We then made a test sample to see if we could make the block. We missed a problem with this block, and it came back to bite us later. Even though our program generated yardage needed, we planned to use scraps from our fabric stash. Here are the fabrics we plan to use for the blocks. All but 4 of the blocks will be made from different prints. Because these pieces will all have edges that are cut on the bias, it is important to use plenty of starch before cutting to help prevent distorting while cutting and handling. We cut the pieces with the warp running in the same direction. We don't know if the warp direction will make any difference. It's just best to keep things the same where possible. We want the warp to run the length of these pieces. We stacked 4 layers together and pinned them using a flat head pin. I thought I had a new blade in the cutter, but it wasn't cutting correctly, so I changed the blade and discovered that the oil on the blade was thick and sticky. The blades are old. I carefully cleaned the blade with sewing machine oil, and that fixed the problem. The rotary blade cannot cut the V-notch in this piece, so it has to be cut with scissors. We bag each set as we cut them. We need to sew the small piece to the large piece. Each piece must be marked the same so that the finished pieces will be exactly the same. They will be sewn face to face, so we marked the large one on the face and the small one on the back. In order to sew these pieces together, it is important to make this cut on the large piece, but not too deep or too shallow. This is just about right. With both pieces marked, we're about ready to start sewing. To do precision sewing, it is important to use a Microtex type sewing needle. The brand is your choice. We're ready to start sewing. The first step is to make sure that the pieces are face to face and that the marked spot of each piece matches exactly. You could use a pin to match the marks. We feel that just eyeballing the marks works. We start in the center and sew out to the edge. We match the seams on the other side and sew from the center out. All of the top and bottom pieces are sewn together. The next step is to sew these together. We should have made these just a little oversized and made a template to cut them to the exact same size after they were sewn together. Lessons learned. We start by sewing 2 adjacent pieces together, making sure each set is the same. I thought that I needed this 1/4 inch space, but found it worked best if it was sewn all the way. Before sewing, it is important to nest the seams of the 2 pieces. It works best to fold the seam on top towards the sewing foot and the seam underneath away from the feed dogs. After sewing, finger press all the seams in the same direction. Next, we sew 2 pairs together, making 2 separate halves of the block. We follow the same process, nesting the seams. Be sure to finger press the seams in the same direction. Clip the ears to reduce bulk in the center of the block. Match the 2 halves at the center seam, making sure that the top seams match the bottom seams. You may need to use a pin through the top and bottom halves to make sure that they match correctly. Sew from the center to the side. Flip the piece over and sew the other side in the same way. Start sewing so that the seam overlaps the seam just a little. Finger press all seams in the same direction. You should see this star shape in the center, and on the top side all points should match in the center. Looking good at this point. Here are all 30 blocks arranged in the order planned. Notice that all white points point to a colored point. Laying the blocks out like this helps keep the proper arrangement. Check the orientation wanted and sew the border piece to the adjacent side. Mark the border piece a 1/4 inch from either edge and position the mark against the seam and sew the 1/4 inch seam. Fold and finger press the seam. Fold this space so that the diagonal edges of both pieces are parallel to each other. They may not match, but they need to be parallel. We need to start this seam exactly where the 3 pieces meet to prevent puckers. Mark the spot and adjust the block until the needle meets the spot and sew the seam. Continue adding border pieces until finished. Iron the seams in the direction desired. At this point, we realized that something was wrong. Very wrong. We unsewed the border. As obvious as this problem was, we didn't notice it before. In looking at the block, each segment is too wide, so the block cannot lay flat. We checked our pattern and saw that it added a 1/16 inch to each segment. 8 pieces adds up to a 1/2 inch too much, and the rest of the problem is a result of my seam width. The solution was to take a slight tuck in each piece. However, because of the variation in this tuck from piece to piece, the pieces were no longer the same. As you can see, they were no longer in line with each other, causing the border of the block to be out of line. Now the pieces lay flat with no excess material. Time to sew the border back on. The next step is to trim all blocks to the exact same size. In order to know the block size, we had to measure enough blocks to figure out the size of the smallest block and then cut all the blocks to that size. We planned an extra 1/4 inch in our pattern for this trimming process. Here are all the blocks trimmed to the same size and ready to be sewn together. We sew the blocks of the first column together and then sew the next column, etc. until each column is sewn. We iron all the seams of the first column facing the same way. We iron the seams of the adjacent column in the opposite direction so that they will nest properly. We alternate the seam direction for each column. We're ready to sew the columns together. We nest the seams of the first two columns and pin them before we start sewing. We sewed 2 columns together, making 3 sets of 2, but we should have sewn 3 columns together, making 2 sets of 3 columns. The quilt is small enough that it didn't matter. All of the columns are sewn together and ready for the next step. We cut the binding and border material at the same time. We like to lay out the border to check that we have enough material and that it looks right. The border is sewn on, ready to be assembled with the back and batting. We start by setting up the quilting frame and thumbtack the back of the quilt to the frame. We tack the 4 corners and the center of each side to pull the back evenly. We add the batting and the quilt top. It is important that the batting does not have any big wrinkles or folds, and the top is gently pulled even and thumbtacked in place about every 8 inches. We safety pin the top about every 5 or 6 inches to keep all 3 layers in place during the sewing process. Here it is, ready to be sewn. Gloves really help move the quilt during the quilting process. This is called fluff and stuff and is the best way to get the quilt through the throat of the sewing machine. We start in the center of the block and sew around each element of the quilt. When doing this process, it is important that the bottom, batting, and top are pulled flat so that no wrinkles are sewn into the underneath side. Keep the sewing area between your hands. Now that the quilt is quilted, it is time to trim the quilt to the final size. We put the cutting mat under the edge and use the rotary trimmer to make the final cut. With the edges trimmed, the quilt is starting to take shape. The binding was cut on the bias and is ready to go. We lay the pieces so that the ends match and the face side is up on both pieces. We put each piece face to face with a 1/4 inch overlap. We use a 1/4 inch seam to sew these together. The seam should align with the groove formed by the overlap of these pieces. We fold the binding in half and iron it. We wound the binding on a piece of cardboard until we were ready to use it. We pin the binding to the top of the quilt and align the cut edges of the binding to the cut edge of the quilt and pin about every 6 inches. To join the start end of the binding to the finish end of the binding, we need an extra 8 or 12 inches of binding on both ends. We do not sew about 12 inches between the start and end of the binding until we sew the ends of the binding together. At the corners we make a fold and then continue pinning the binding around the quilt. At the corners we fold the binding away from the sewing path and end 1/4 of an inch from the new edge. Do not sew over the fold. We fold the binding back over the seam just sewn and start sewing the next edge of the quilt and continue around the quilt doing the same at each corner. We mark each end of the binding with a 45-degree angle. The binding needs to overlap by 1/2 inch so that they can be sewn together. We use a clip to pull the quilt together in order to manipulate and sew the binding. Lay the binding ends face to face and sew with a 1/4 inch seam, and then finish sewing the binding to the quilt top. We pull the binding to the back side of the quilt and sew it with a hem stitch. We like to pin the binding as it helps reduce the strain on the thumb. Time to take care of all those loose ends. After we are done clipping loose ends, we always find more. Threads on the blue background are easy to see, but the white on white is more difficult. Masking tape does a good job of picking up those loose ends. We make a label with name and dates for our quilts. We sew the label on using a hem stitch to the underside of the quilt. The finished product looks pretty good, but even with all my fancy equipment, the ladies that sewed the original quilt were so much better. They win the challenge hands down. I wonder if they were laughing at us as we made this quilt. Thanks for watching and have a great day.